welcome to you all. I want to start with the two guests coming both from China and the United States. What to you, Mr. Yang, is a successful meeting? Briefly.
Well, China's expectation is set up a strategic framework between by the two presidents, say cooperation, enhancing cooperation, control the differences. If we reach that goal, that will be successful meeting. That means focus on general issue rather than a specific issue.
I see. Mr. Daly, what about from the U.S. side?
I think on the U.S. side, it's very much what Professor Yang just described. People are not looking for deal-making in Mar-a-Lago. There's a strong sense that the American side is not yet quite ready to start thinking about solutions to particular problems. If they can meet and think that, that their counterpart is a rational, constructive person, put some issues, frankly, on the table, that's enough.
Dr. Lim, what about for the rest of the world, including neighbors in Asia? What is a successful meeting to you?
This is a very important meeting. A lot of people will be paying attention to it. The most important output from this meeting is being able to know each other for the two countries, for the two leaders, being able to know each other and being able to be diplomatic and also have the right symbols to kick off a relationship bilaterally.
Mr. Daly, there has been a tradition that the U.S. side usually during the first meeting want to emphasize on specific issues. This time, of course, DPRK, trade, probably anti-terrorism, and what's going on in Syria. However, in China, it's different. Chinese want to look at the framework with which the two sides can work together, or not. Mr. Daly, what do you make of this difference?
Right, you're pointing to an important clash sometimes in political cultures that can easily lead to misunderstandings. The Chinese side, as you say, is looking not only for a framework, but sometimes for particular phrases, like the great model of major power relations that are vague but positive and with a thought that we will fill in the details later. There's nothing offensive in this, but it's a foreign concept to Americans. We tend to want to get down to cases, to progress on particular issues right away, and frankly, we don't really understand this broad framing language. There's a good deal of wariness about it, and so while I'm sure that General Secretary Xi will propose it, I hope he won't push it too hard, because should President Trump appear to accept some broad Chinese phrase for the relationship, he would probably get a lot of pushback.
Talking about phrases, there are several things that Chinese President Xi Jinping said before the meeting in Mar-a-Lago. President Xi and Trump each spoke of their hopes for a stronger Sino-U.S. relationship. For example, during their talks on the phone, President Xi said during U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson's visit as well in mid-March that cooperation is the only correct choice, end of quote. And also, when President Xi and his U.S. counterpart had their first phone conversation in February, President Xi said he is ready to work with the U.S. side to improve bilateral ties and benefit the two peoples. Okay, let's go to Mr. Yang. Chinese use several phrases.
Yep.
4 words Chinese used to use to describe major power relations.
Yep.
Mr. Tillerson, Secretary of State, repeated that.
Yep.
Is it likely, as Mr. Daly suspected, that Chinese is also going to do that during this meeting?
Well, China raised 4 phrases, and Tillerson repeated. That means the two sides have got a consensus in principle, and the rest task for both sides is how to explore the way towards the shared goal. I think this meeting cannot solve this issue. That could open a good starting point and let the working level officials to explore further.
It really depends on the degree of adoption of these 4 words. Mr. Daly was waving his head while you were saying the U.S. side already confirmed these 4 words. Certainly, we got some differences over there. Mr. Daly, your views here.
Well, there's a very strong sense on the Washington side that Secretary Tillerson had heard these words before, quite likely from the Chinese embassy or perhaps from Yang Jiechi when he was in Washington, and may very well have used them in Beijing in an effort to be friendly, but perhaps without an understanding of the specific history and meaning of these words, and without an understanding of the reason, the Obama administration had been very careful of working around them. And so it will be interesting to see whether that is repeated. If the American side repeats that phraseology in Mar-a-Lago, I think then we can say that that is an informed decision. But again, what it means going forward, cooperation, yes, but the sources of competition are real and in some ways growing. So the question is also, how do we acknowledge and manage those? We can't simply pretend that everything is win-win.
Right. We can go into details about the issue of DPRK, about trade, about anti-terrorism, about Syria. Each would take us probably 4 days to debate about. But let me just ask both of you very important things here. Mr. Daly, from you, what do you think of the recent changes with the U.S. international relations team or foreign policy team mean for Mr. Trump's possible choices about his China policy, We all know Mr. Bannon just overnight was dismissed from the National Security Council. So what would that mean eventually for the overall streamline of the Trump administration foreign policy team?
I think what we're seeing is a gradual moderation of the views that candidate Trump expressed during the campaign. We see more people like McMaster, like General Mattis at Defense coming in, who may play a more moderating role, and I think we're seeing a gradual return to traditional approaches to China. That said, President Trump's instincts may not have changed, and so this more nationalist emphasis on competition in U.S.-China relations, which we see on the Chinese side as well. In my view, both Xi and Trump see the relationship in fundamentally adversarial terms and are looking to cooperate against that background. So yes, we see a moderation on the Trump side, but I still think that the forces of competition and mutual suspicion are quite strong and have to be dealt with.
Is it really, Mr. Yang?
Well, I think on the surface, the two powers relation is really is in nature of adversary. But in nature, the two countries' interests has tied too close to be split. Therefore, in general, it's not difficult for two sides to get a consensus about the four phrases. But in reality, it's extremely difficult to find a way to how to control the differences, how to manage the crisis, how to enhance the cooperation. Beautiful words, but very very tough tasks.
So let's talk about the tests. Before we go to our Singaporean guest, let's go to the both of you once again about issues of DPRK and the trade. Yesterday, we have a whole debate about how the recent development on the Korean Peninsula might impact on the very first meeting between the two presidents. But there has been suggestion very clearly from some of the panelists, Mr. Yang, that we should see the fundamental interests of the two countries not being blurred when our insights by some of the daily events, Mr. Yang.
Yeah, 2 points. Number one, neither China nor U.S. want to see a war in the Western Pacific area. And number two, both China and the U.S. want to see a sustainable prosperity in the Pacific so that the two countries can make a joint venture for making money.
All right. So if the leaders are smart enough, it seems that Mr. Yang are suggesting from both sides, there are possibilities to work on this issue. Mr. Daly, is it?
Yes, I agree with Professor Yang, who has played a major role in U.S., Chinese, and multilateral dialogues on this issue, a major, and I would say, very constructive role. So I think that the spirit he has just described is a very good one from which to begin, but it also has to be informed by the fact that South Korea faces an acute problem. Nuclear threats, threats of annihilation from just north of the border, about 50 kilometers away. And any responsible South Korean leader or South Korean ally has to put the defense of those people in the short term high at the top of the list. But I think that Professor Yang has described a good way to start this discussion.
We see not only the U.S. and Chinese side are involved. Very interestingly, Dr. Lim, there is another country that President Trump called, not your country, Singapore, but rather Japan. It reminded us with the occasion before President Trump's meeting with President Abe from Japan. He also made a phone call to the Chinese side, to the Chinese president. So what do you make of this apparent strategic balance, it seems, the Trump White House is trying to play up here?
I think the U.S. is shoring up its traditional alliance with Japan. It is also reaching out to Chinese for partnership in sort of mitigating and downplaying the tensions in the Korean peninsula. And so the U.S. plays a very pivotal role in aggregating the interests of its major ally and also its major partner in the region. And this is a good opportunity for the major powers in the region to work together. And certainly China and the US have the capabilities to contribute to the process. And so there's a lot of expectations in the region that the two may help to at least lower some temperatures in the Korean peninsula. And it is not realistic for this summit to resolve all the issues, but they can continue dialogue at different levels of the government in the future opportunities.
That's right. Mr. Daly, there have been suggestions whether it is strategic ambiguity the Trump White House is playing right now, or still lack of content when it comes to its relations with China and also global policies. So in that regard, people worried, Mr. Daly, whether the Trump White House is going to be swayed by ideas coming from certain countries or certain interest groups. What's your take?
Well, this is a question not only in the case of U.S.-China relations, but with many other issues as well. Because we have an administration in which the president and many of his advisors have never been involved in government before, it is likely to take this administration a little bit longer than most to settle down into the policies that it is actually going to be enacting over 4 or 8 years and to get its people in place. For that reason, I think China understands this, and China has actually been pretty patient. I would give China high marks for its reception of, its reaction to some of the statements of President-elect Trump in between the election and the inauguration. I think that patience will continue to be called for perhaps a year longer. So even at Mar-a-Lago, I think we shouldn't parse statements too closely as indications of directions that the Trump administration is definitely taking. This is why I disagreed with Professor Yang that Secretary Tillerson's statements in Beijing that seem to affirm Chinese language indicate a consensus.
Okay.
It's too soon to know that. It's going to remain too soon, I would say, for at least half a year and possibly longer.
Mr. Yang, Mr. Daly, and many others complimented China's patience, it seems, in its recent approach to the Trump White House. What do you think about that patience? There are even suggesting coming up before the meeting in the U.S. press about the strategies of war, the 36 of them coming from Asian China. Some are suggesting there shouldn't be a strategy of war, but rather strategies of peace. Mr. Yang, what is your take?
Well, no matter you're patient or impatient, China has to wait and see, simply because the theme of Trump in terms of national security hasn't been formed completely. For example, even the key officials say Deputy Secretary of State, Assistant Secretary for East Asia and the Pacific, yet to be named. So before the team is completed, the policy review completed, we cannot have a chance to look up the whole policy about Trump toward this region.
That really brings us to an important question, gentlemen. That is, on what kind of platform, within what kind of framework in our distinctive systems that this U.S.-China relationship is likely to be portrayed, weighed, and also in a way articulated? Mr. Daly. There used to be strategic and economic dialogue, strategic economic dialogue for Mr. Trump. Right. Is there likely to be possibility this time to President talk about some kinds of mechanism?
It appears that they will be discussing mechanisms, perhaps higher level, and taking, instead of a strategic and economic dialogue, they may take the two parts of that dialogue apart. So you have one strategic track and you have an economic track as well. I think that you phrased the question well, in that going forward we have to figure out whether there is a positive basis for U.S.-China relations going forward. When we came together in the 1970s, the positive basis was a joint desire to work together to counteract the Soviet Union. Right now we have a negative basis for relations, in that both sides recognize that we must not go to war, we must not become enemies. But again, that's merely a negative foundation. Can there be a positive foundation that admits the many problems in the relationship, the very different systems, the very different values, and yet that finds something that's real, not manufactured for propaganda purposes, but tangible and real, and a call to action that can bring the countries closer together? We don't have an answer to that yet. Mere phrases like win-win don't solve that. So this is one of the major challenges over the coming year or two, a positive basis for relations.
Well, words don't solve that, but will the spirit of win-win really solve that, Mr. Yang?
Well, we are now at a historical and critical crossroad between two countries. We have a beautiful world, beautiful goals. Now we need a strategic wisdom from both sides to explore the ways towards the beautiful goals.
Both of you are very compassionate, shall I say, in your answers about the U.S.-China relations future. Certainly, you guys have been working so hard for it. We put a little bit these serious discussion aside. Let's just talk about the personalities of the two presidents, which is interesting. President Trump, for example, his handshake style when he meets global leaders has prompted some reactions and also talks on social media. When he met with Japanese Prime Minister Abe in February, Mr. Trump took Mr. Abe's hand and they shook hands for 19 seconds. That's well known already worldwide. However, last month, Mr. Trump greeted German Chancellor Angela Merkel with a handshake upon her arrival, but appeared to not necessarily responding to her on other occasions. That's also known to the rest of the world. So many are looking at Mr. Lim, how the two presidents are likely to respond to one another on camera, person to person. How much would that really tell us about the nature of these relations and the efforts, at least, they would like to make about it?
Within China and also East Asia, President Trump is seen to be a successful businessman, someone who can talk business, and also someone who is very frank about his view. And President Xi is seen to be a very collected, very calm, studied person. So these two personalities have both the complementarities and also parts that may not be as so. But in the events leading up to the event of the summit, both leaders have shown great maturity and also calm in building up the atmosphere for the summit. For example, President Trump has said that he respects China, and also President Xi and his administration have repeatedly said that they look forward to doing business with the US. So this has created the positive atmosphere for the summit to take place, and it shows a great maturity on both sides.
Just in a few hours, we're going to see the meetings between the two presidents, their first informal face-to-face. Of course, there are expectations from everyone around the world that are watching this event very closely, particularly the three of you, I would understand. So shall we, from your side, help us to understand what can be done over the next 24 hours? Mr. Daly, once again.
Over the next 24 hours, I think it's very simple. They need to have a constructive, frank discussion of their positions, where they agree and where they don't. Not try to make any deals, not try to solve any problems. Simply figure out whether they are able to speak together and set up mechanisms and agreements to continue and deepen that dialogue, and also to charge and enable their diplomatic and other bureaucracies to manage the relationship.
Dr. Lim, very briefly.
Yes, the region hopes that both show outwardly to the rest of the world that they can get to know each other well, and in the high context culture of East Asia, also symbolically that they are able to work together for future meetings and initiatives.
I see. Mr. Yang, final words briefly.
Lot of huge issues, but the two presidents will pave a way for the detailed, pragmatic dialogues on the individual big issues. This time only have a framework and a consensus.